Torch No Grad. Description. Explain in detail. The Torch No Grad Context Manager is a mechanism used in PTorch to disable gradient calculation during model operations. This is particularly useful for various scenarios like inference, optimizing memory usage, or accelerating computations. Inputs. Input 1. Explain in detail. The Torch No Grad Context Manager doesn't require any specific input parameters. It acts as a wrapper around a block of code where gradient calculation is disabled. Input 2. Explain in detail. The input to Torch No Grad is the code block within which you want to prevent gradient computation. Outputs. Output 1. Explain in detail. The primary output of using Torch No Grad is a block of code where gradient tracking is temporarily turned off. Output 2. Explain in detail. The Torch No Grad Context Manager returns a context manager object which manages the disabling of gradient calculation within the specified code block. Steps. Step 1. Explain in detail. The Torch No Grad Context Manager is applied using the with statement, indicating the scope where gradients are disabled. Step 2. Explain in detail within the with Torch No Grad block. All operations involving tensors and operations like backpropagation will not track gradients. Challenges and fixes. Challenge 1. Explain in detail. Attempting to backpropagate through a model or perform optimization steps during Torch No Grad can lead to errors, as gradients are not calculated. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 1. Calling loss, backward or optimizer step within a Torch No Grad context would result in an error. Fixes to challenge 1. Ensure that backpropagation and optimizer steps occur outside of a Torch No Grad context. Challenge 2. Explain in detail. Using Torch No Grad inappropriately can lead to unexpected behavior. If gradient calculations are crucial for certain operations within the code block. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 2. Applying Torch No Grad during the training process of a model can hinder the model's ability to learn and update its parameters. Fixes to challenge 2. Use Torch No Grad judiciously, primarily for inference, memory optimization, or speeding up calculations when gradients are not needed. Avoid using it during training unless absolutely necessary. Torch Autograd Grad Mode Set Grade Enabled. Description. Torch Autograd Grad Mode, a context manager that allows you to selectively enable or disable gradient tracking in PTorch. It provides two primary ways to control gradient computation. Torch Autograd Set Grade Enabled Mode, a function that globally sets the gradient tracking mode for all subsequent operations. With Torch No Grad, a context manager that temporarily disables gradient tracking within a specific code block. The with Torch No Grad context manager does not return any value explicitly. The Torch Autograd Set Grade Enabled Mode function returns the previous gradient tracking mode as a Boolean value. The Torch Autograd Set Grade Enabled Mode function globally sets the gradient tracking mode for all subsequent operations. If mode is true, gradient computation is enabled. If mode is false, gradient computation is disabled. The with Torch No Grad context manager provides a way to temporarily disable gradient tracking within a specific code block. When entering the context, gradient computation is disabled. When exiting the context, gradient computation is restored to its previous state. Challenge 1. Unexpected gradient behavior when using Torch Autograd Set Grade Enabled Mode. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 1. If you forget to reset the gradient tracking mode after using Torch autograd, set grade-enabled mode. Subsequent operations might inherit the modified mode, leading to unexpected behavior. Fixes to challenge 1. Always ensure you reset the gradient tracking mode to its desired state after using torch, autograd, set grade-enabled mode. This can be done by calling torch, autograd, set grade-enabled true or torch, autograd, set grade-enabled false. As needed, use the with torch, no-grad context manager to manage gradient tracking within specific code blocks, which automatically restores the previous state after exiting the block. Challenge 2. Unintended resource consumption. Sample use case that resulted in challenge 2. Leaving gradient tracking enabled during inference can lead to unnecessary memory consumption and computational overhead. Fixes to challenge 2. Use torch, autograd, set grade-enabled false or the with torch, no-grad context manager when performing inference or computations where gradients are not required. Ensure you disable gradient computation in any code blocks where it is not needed. Optimizing performance and resource usage. Torch is grade-enabled. Description. Inputs: none. Boolean value indicating whether gradient calculations are enabled for the current context. True indicates that gradients are enabled, while false indicates that gradients are disabled. Steps. The function checks the global gradient enabled flag within ptorch. It returns a Boolean value representing the current state of the flag. Unexpected gradient calculation. If the gradient calculation is enabled even when you expect it to be disabled. This can occur if the torch, no-grad context manager has not been properly applied or if a part of your code modifies the global gradient enabled flag. Ensure that the torch, no-grad context manager is used appropriately around the code where you want to disable gradient calculations. No gradient calculation. When gradients are disabled, operations involving tensors will not track their gradients, which can lead to issues with optimization algorithms or gradient-based analysis. Double-check that the gradient calculations are enabled when needed. Use torch, set grade-enabled true to re-enable gradient calculations. Torch autograd grad mode inference mode. Description. ptorch autograd provides the core functionality for automatic differentiation. Grad mode and inference mode are context managers that control whether gradients are tracked during computation. Grad mode enables gradient tracking and is the default mode. Inference mode disables gradient tracking and is typically used for inference and model evaluation. Inputs. No direct inputs. Outputs. No direct outputs. Steps. With torch, inference mode disables gradient tracking for operations performed within the context. This can significantly improve performance during inference as gradients are not calculated. With torch, no grad. Equivalent to torch, inference mode disables gradient tracking. With torch, enable grad. Enables gradient tracking. This is the default behavior in ptorch. Challenges and fixes. Challenge 1. Unexpected gradient calculations during inference. Sample use case attempting to perform inference on a model without explicitly disabling gradient tracking. Fixes. Use torch, inference mode or torch, no grad to disable gradient calculations during inference. Challenge 2. Memory overhead due to gradient tracking. Sample use case performing large-scale operations or training models with a high number of parameters while gradient tracking is enabled. Fixes. Use torch, inference mode or torch, no grad to disable gradient tracking during inference or model evaluation. This can significantly reduce memory consumption. Challenge 3. Incorrect model behavior when gradients are disabled. Sample use case using operations that rely on gradient calculations during inference, e.g. weight updates in training. Fixes ensure that operations used during inference do not rely on gradient calculations. Use appropriate techniques for model evaluation without modifying weights or using gradient-based optimization.